The river had been here long before the first houses appeared. It came down from the mountains, cold, clear, and quiet. In the mornings, a soft mist often floated above the water. Beneath the surface, smooth stones shone like silver. On one gentle bend of the river stood a small fishing village. There were only a few old wooden houses. A couple of boats lay upside down on the shore, and a narrow path led from the riverbank into the forest. This was where an old fisherman lived. His name was Thomas, but most people in the village simply called him Grandpa Thomas. He had lived beside this river almost his entire life. He knew the river well. He knew its moods. He knew every shallow stone beneath the water. He knew where the trout hid in summer and where they moved when the water turned cold in autumn. His house stood a little apart from the others. It was a small wooden cabin. The walls were dark with age. The chimney leaned slightly to one side. Behind the house stood an old smokehouse. A thin line of smoke almost always rose from its roof, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and fish. That smell mixed with the scent of the river, wet wood, and the cool mountain wind. Near the shore rested two old boats. One of them was very old. The wood was dark, almost black, worn by years of water and weather. The second boat was a little newer, but it also carried the marks of many seasons of work. Every spring, Grandpa Thomas repaired them. He sanded the boards, replaced old nails, and sealed the wood with tar. He often said, "A boat is like an old horse. Take care of it, and it will serve you for many years." That summer, his grandson came to visit. The boy's name was Lucas. He was 11 years old. Lucas had grown up in the city, where rivers were narrow and muddy, and fish were rarely seen. When Lucas first saw the mountain river, he stood on the shore for a long time, just watching the water. It was so clear he could see the stones resting on the riverbed. "Are there really fish in there?" he asked quietly. Grandpa Thomas smiled. "Oh, yes," he said, "and they're very clever." Lucas turned toward him. "Are we going to catch them?" The old fisherman looked at the river for a moment, as if greeting an old friend. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes, we will." They walked toward the small shed beside the house. Inside, the air was cool. It smelled of rope, wood, and old fishing gear. Fishing nets hung from the walls, floats, hooks, wooden boxes, and long fishing rods rested in the corners. Lucas looked around as if he had discovered a treasure room. "Is all of this for fishing?" he asked. Grandpa Thomas shook his head gently. "No," he said, "this is for living." He picked up an old float from the table and slowly turned it between his fingers. "Fishing is not only about fish," he said. "It's about patience and work." Lucas listened carefully. Outside, the river moved quietly past the shore. The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a seagull cried. Grandpa Thomas placed the float back on the table. Then he looked at the boy. His eyes were calm, like still water in a quiet pool. "This summer," he said slowly, "you will learn everything." Lucas smiled. He did not yet know about the early mornings ahead of him, the cold water, the smell of smoked fish, the long days of hard work, or the joy of his first real catch. But the river was already flowing beside them, and the river had many things to teach.
Real fishing did not begin on the river. It began here,
in the old wooden shed behind the house. That morning, the sun was only beginning to rise over the mountains when Lucas stepped into the yard. The air was cool. A thin mist still floated above the river. Grandpa Thomas was already working. He opened the heavy door of the shed, and a stripe of morning light fell across the wooden floor. Lucas stepped inside and stopped. The shed was larger than it looked from the outside. Fishing nets hung along the walls. Ropes and old fishing rods rested in the corners. On the shelves were small boxes filled with hooks, floats, and metal sinkers. Everything looked old, but everything was carefully kept. Grandpa Thomas picked up one of the fishing nets and spread it across a long wooden table. "The season has not started yet," he said, "but fishing begins long before the first fish." Lucas stepped closer. The net was thin but strong. In several places the threads were torn. "Is that bad?" asked Lucas. "Very bad," Grandpa Thomas replied. He took a small spool of thread and sat down on a wooden bench. "One small hole," he said, "and the fish will escape." Lucas watched closely. The old fisherman's fingers moved quickly and confidently. Grandpa Thomas wove the threads together as if he were repairing a spider's web. "Try it," he said. Lucas took the thread. At first, his knots were clumsy. The line tangled. His fingers slipped. Grandpa Thomas showed him again and again. "Don't hurry," he said. "Fishing does not like hurry." When the nets were repaired, they moved on to the fishing rods. Grandpa Thomas took a long fishing line and stretched it between his hands. "Look closely," he said. Lucas leaned in. The line was almost invisible, but in one place it shone slightly. "It's weaker here," Grandpa Thomas said. "If a big trout pulls on it, it will break." He cut the damaged piece of line and tied a new one. "The knot must be small," he said, "and strong." He showed Lucas how to tighten the line properly. "Now you try." The boy slowly repeated the movements. After a few attempts, the knot looked neat and tight. Grandpa Thomas nodded. "Good." Next, they checked the hooks. Some of them were dull. Grandpa Thomas took a small sharpening stone and carefully sharpened them. The metal made a quiet scraping sound. "A hook must be sharp," he said. "Otherwise the fish will feel freedom." Time passed slowly. The sun rose higher in the sky. Through the open door of the shed, Lucas could see the river shining in the morning light. For a moment, he felt that the work was a little dull. No fish, no boat, just knots, threads, and old fishing gear. Grandpa Thomas seemed to read his thoughts. He set the knife down and looked at the boy. "Most people think fishing begins when you throw the line into the water," he said. He lifted one of the finished rigs. "But real fishing begins here." Lucas stayed quiet. Grandpa Thomas smiled slightly. "A poorly prepared line," he said, "is a lost fish." Then he placed his hand on the table. "And one more thing." Lucas looked up. The old fisherman watched him calmly. "You don't catch fish with your hands." Lucas tilted his head. "With what then?" Grandpa Thomas answered quietly. "With patience." Outside the shed, the river flowed slowly past the shore, and it was already waiting for them. That morning, Lucas woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet. Outside the window, the sky was still dark, but somewhere in the distance, the first birds had begun to sing. The air was cool, and the river carried the fresh smell of water and stone. Lucas dressed quickly and stepped outside. Grandpa Thomas was already there. He stood beside the boat, checking the oars. The grass was covered with morning dew, and a thick mist drifted slowly over the river. "You woke up early," Grandpa Thomas said, without turning around. "I didn't want to be late," Lucas replied. The old fisherman smiled. "You are never late for fishing," he said, "but it's always good to arrive before the sun." Together they pushed the boat into the water. The wood creaked softly as the boat touched the current. Lucas carefully climbed inside. The river was almost perfectly still. Mist floated above the surface, and for a moment it felt as if the river was still asleep. Grandpa Thomas picked up the oars. The boat began to glide forward. The oars slipped into the water almost without sound. Only a soft splash disturbed the quiet morning. Lucas looked around with wide eyes. The riverbanks were dark beneath the shadows of the trees. Now and then, stones beneath the clear water flashed in the dim light. They floated in silence for several minutes. Then Grandpa Thomas nodded toward a bend in the river. "Do you see that darker water near the rock?" Lucas looked carefully. The current there moved a little slower. "Yes," he said. "Trout often wait there." Lucas frowned slightly. "But I don't see anything." "You won't," Grandpa Thomas said calmly, "because trout are clever fish." The boat slowed and stopped. Grandpa Thomas handed Lucas the fishing rod. "Try." Lucas carefully cast the line into the water. The float touched the surface and began to drift gently. 1 minute passed, then another. Nothing. "Maybe there aren't any fish there," Lucas said. Grandpa Thomas shook his head. "There are." "Then why aren't they biting?" The old fisherman looked at the river. "Because you're not looking the right way yet." Lucas stared at the water. "What does that mean?" Grandpa Thomas pointed toward the current. "Watch the water," he said. "Where the current is strong, fish don't stay long. They look for places where the water brings food but doesn't steal their strength." Lucas looked more carefully, and suddenly he noticed something new. The water really did move differently in different places. Some parts moved faster, some slower. In some places, small circular ripples appeared. "There," Grandpa Thomas said, pointing behind a large rock. "There the water is calmer." Lucas cast his line again. The float settled into the quiet water. Several more minutes passed. Still nothing. Lucas sighed softly. Grandpa Thomas chuckled. "Don't worry," he said. He rested one hand on the edge of the boat. "Today you won't catch many fish." Lucas looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because today," the old fisherman said, "you are not catching fish." Lucas tilted his head. "Then what am I catching?" Grandpa Thomas looked out across the misty river. "The river," he said quietly. They continued drifting along the bank. Grandpa Thomas pointed out new places. "There's deep water. There are stones. And there, cold water flows from a spring." Lucas cast the line again and again. Sometimes the float did not move at all. Sometimes the current pulled it away. Not a single fish. But Lucas began to notice things he had never seen before. How the water changed around the rocks. How the shadow of a tree fell across the quiet current. How the river seemed to speak in its own quiet voice. By the time the sun rose above the forest, they returned to the shore. The boat slid gently onto the sand. Lucas felt a little disappointed. "I didn't catch anything," he said. Grandpa Thomas tied the boat to an old wooden stake. Then he looked at the river and answered calmly. "No," he said. "Today you learned to listen." Lucas looked back at the water. Now it seemed a little different to him, as if the river really had been telling a story all along.
The next morning, Lucas woke up even earlier. Now he understood something important. The best time for fishing was when the sun had just begun to touch the tops of the trees. Grandpa Thomas was already waiting by the boat. Mist once again floated over the river. But today, Lucas looked at the water differently. He noticed the current, he noticed the stones, and he noticed the quiet places where the water became deeper. They pushed the boat into the river and slowly drifted toward the middle. The boat stopped near a familiar rock. Lucas picked up the fishing rod. This time he did not hurry. He looked at the water, at the current, at the small, calm area behind the rock. Only then did he cast the line. The float touched the water. Lucas watched it carefully. 1 minute passed, then another. The water moved quietly. The float rocked gently. Lucas almost stopped breathing, and suddenly the float disappeared beneath the water. "Grandpa!" Lucas shouted. The fishing rod bent sharply. Something strong was pulling downward. Lucas panicked. "Hold it," Grandpa Thomas said calmly. The boy gripped the rod so tightly that his fingers turned pale. "It's big." "Don't rush," the old fisherman said. The fishing line stretched tight. The fish suddenly darted to the side. Lucas nearly lost his balance. "Slowly," Grandpa Thomas said. "Give it some water." The fish pulled again. Then it paused. Lucas slowly began pulling the line back. Suddenly the water splashed. A silver body flashed on the surface. "Trout!" Lucas shouted. The fish jerked once more, but this time Lucas held the rod more confidently. Grandpa Thomas picked up the net and leaned over the water. "Bring it closer." Lucas carefully pulled the line. One more movement, and the fish slipped into the net. The boat rocked gently. Lucas stared at his catch with wide eyes. The trout was beautiful, silver, with dark spots across its back. Its tail still moved slightly inside the net. Lucas could hardly believe it. I caught it." Grandpa Thomas smiled. He looked at the boy with quiet pride. "Yes," he said. Lucas carefully lifted the fish into his hands. It was cold and strong. "It's real," he whispered. Grandpa Thomas laughed softly. Then he placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Now," he said, "you are a real fisherman." Lucas looked out across the river. The mist was slowly disappearing. The sun was rising above the trees, and the water continued to flow quietly past them, as if nothing special had happened. But for Lucas, this morning changed everything.
A few days had passed since the morning when Lucas caught his first trout. Now everything felt a little different. He already knew how to hold the fishing rod. He knew how to watch the current. And he knew that sometimes the most important thing was simply to wait. The mornings always began the same way. Before sunrise, Lucas would hear the quiet creak of the door. That was Grandpa Thomas stepping outside. Then came the soft rustling of fishing gear, the sound of an oar being placed in the boat, and the smell of the early river. Lucas dressed quickly and followed him outside. That morning the air felt warmer than usual. The sky above the mountains was slowly growing lighter. The first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the trees. Together, they pushed the boat into the water. The wooden hull touched the river with a quiet splash. The boat began drifting slowly with the current. The mist had almost disappeared. The water looked clear and calm. "Today is a good day," Grandpa Thomas said. Lucas looked at the river. "Why?" The old fisherman pointed to the surface. "See that? The current is steady, the wind is light, and the insects are already flying." Lucas looked closer. Tiny insects really were touching the water, leaving small circles across the surface. "Trout like that," Grandpa Thomas explained. The boat stopped near a quiet place behind a large rock. Lucas cast the line. The floater settled gently on the water. Only a few seconds passed. The floater trembled. "Lucas," Grandpa Thomas said quietly. The floater suddenly disappeared. Lucas lifted the rod quickly. "Got it!" The rod bent sharply. The fish pulled hard. But this time, Lucas did not panic. He kept the line steady and did not rush. After a minute, a silver trout slid into the net. "Good," Grandpa Thomas said. They placed the fish into the basket. Then they cast their lines again. That day the river was generous. The trout were biting often. Sometimes the fish were small, sometimes a little bigger, but almost every cast made the floater move. Lucas began to feel the rhythm. Cast the line, wheat, feel the pull, lift the rod. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The water began to shine in the light. Birds flew low over the river, sometimes diving suddenly toward the surface. At one moment, Lucas pulled up a different fish. It was slimmer, with a long fin and bright silver sides. "What is this?" he asked. Grandpa Thomas looked and nodded. "Grayling." Lucas studied the fish carefully. Its fin was large and beautiful, like a small sail. "Beautiful," Lucas said. "Very," the old fisherman agreed. The basket slowly filled. The fish moved quietly beneath a damp cloth. When the sun rose high in the sky, they took a short break. Grandpa Thomas took bread and a piece of cheese from his bag. They sat in the boat and looked out at the river. The water flowed calmly. "You are doing well," Grandpa Thomas said. Lucas smiled. "I like this." Grandpa Thomas nodded. "Fishing is a good craft." Lucas looked at the full basket. "It's very fun." The old fisherman chuckled softly. "And hard work." Lucas thought about that. His hands were slightly sore from the rod. His fingers smelled of fish and river water. His shirt was damp from splashes, but he felt happy. They returned to fishing. A few more casts, and each time the water moved again. Another trout, another grayling. When the basket was almost full, Grandpa Thomas looked at the sun. "That's enough for today." Lucas looked at the fish. The basket was heavy now. They slowly drifted back toward the shore. The boat glided quietly across the water. Lucas looked at the river and thought. Before this, he believed fishing was only the moment when the float disappeared beneath the water. But now he understood something else. Fishing is waking up early, repairing your gear, waiting for hours, watching the water and listening to the current, and only sometimes catching a fish. Lucas looked at Grandpa Thomas. The old fisherman held the oars calmly, moving the boat forward in a steady rhythm. And suddenly, Lucas realized something simple. Fishing is not only excitement, it is daily work. And that is exactly what makes it real. When the boat touched the shore, the sun was already high above the forest. The water shimmered in the light. A warm wind moved gently through the tops of the trees. Lucas jumped onto the sand and helped Grandpa Thomas pull the boat onto the bank. The basket of fish was heavy. When Lucas lifted it, he was surprised by how much they had caught. "Careful," Grandpa Thomas said. "Don't spill it." Lucas nodded and carefully placed the basket on the grass. Trout and grayling lay side by side. Their silver sides shone softly in the sunlight. "Are we gonna eat all of this?" Lucas asked. Grandpa Thomas smiled. "No, half of it will go to the village." They lifted the basket and walked along the narrow path that led from the river to the small settlement. The path passed between old trees. The ground was soft, and leaves rustled quietly beneath their feet. Lucas walked beside his grandfather, trying to carry the basket evenly. When they came out of the forest, the village appeared before them. A few wooden houses stood along a narrow road. Near some yards, laundry hung in the sun. Near others, stacks of firewood were piled neatly. When people noticed Grandpa Thomas, they began stepping outside. "Good morning, Thomas," an old man called from a gate. "Good morning," Grandpa Thomas replied. Lucas noticed that people were looking at the basket. Two children ran closer. "Did you go fishing today?" a small girl asked. Lucas nodded. "A lot." The children looked into the basket and gasped with excitement. "Wow!" Near one house, an elderly woman stood, wearing a dark scarf. She slowly walked toward them. Grandpa Thomas greeted her. "Good day, Mrs. Miller." The woman looked at the fish. "A fine catch." Grandpa Thomas chose a large trout and handed it to her. "Fresh, caught this morning." The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a few coins. Grandpa Thomas shook his head. No, fish should be affordable. Lucas watched quietly. They walked a little farther. Near another house, an old man stood with a walking stick.
His hands trembled slightly. "Thomas," he said softly, "did you have luck today?" Grandpa Thomas smiled. He took a grayling from the basket and handed it to him. The man began searching for money. "No need," Grandpa Thomas said. "But please, take it." The old man looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you, my friend." They continued walking. Lucas noticed that people were truly waiting for them. Children ran nearby. Some adults stepped onto their porches to greet Grandpa Thomas, and almost everyone looked at the basket. Near a small house, a young woman stood with two children. Grandpa Thomas stopped. He said nothing. He simply took two fish from the basket and handed them to her. The woman looked surprised. "Thomas, I will pay next week." Grandpa Thomas shook his head. "That's not necessary. But please, take it." The woman accepted the fish quietly. Gratitude shone in her eyes. When they walked away from the house, Lucas asked softly, "Why didn't you take the money?" Grandpa Thomas walked slowly, looking at the road. They have a hard time. Lucas thought for a moment. But you worked for this. The old fisherman nodded. Yes. They walked a few more steps. Then Grandpa Thomas stopped and looked at the boy. Lucas, he said calmly, fishing is not only work. He nodded toward the river, which could be seen between the trees. The river gives us fish. Lucas listened carefully. Grandpa Thomas continued, the river gives more than one person needs. Lucas looked at the basket. There were still several fish inside. That is why we share. He looked again toward the river and spoke quietly. The river gives enough for everyone. Lucas nodded silently. That day, he understood something new. Fishing is not only water, boats, and fishing gear. Sometimes it means something more. Sometimes it means helping others.
When they returned from the village, the sun was already beginning to lean toward the forest. The yard near Grandpa Thomas's house was quiet. Only the river murmured softly behind the trees, and somewhere in the grass, insects were buzzing. There were still a few fish left in the basket. Lucas placed it on the wooden table near the shed and wiped his hands. "What are we going to do with the rest?" he asked. Grandpa Thomas looked at the fish and smiled. "Now you will see one of the most important things in fishing." Lucas tilted his head with curiosity. "What is it?" The old fisherman pointed to a small wooden building behind the house, the smokehouse. Lucas had noticed it before, a small dark hut with a narrow chimney. A light smell of smoke always drifted from it, mixing with the scent of the river. "That's where we preserve the fish," Grandpa Thomas said, "and make it even better." They carried the basket to a long wooden table under a roof. Grandpa Thomas took out a knife with a wooden handle. "First, we prepare the fish." Lucas watched carefully. Grandpa Thomas picked up a trout and placed it gently on the board. "Watch closely." The knife moved confidently and calmly. In a few smooth motions, he cleaned the fish, removed the insides, and rinsed it in a bucket of cold water. "Now you." Lucas felt a little nervous. He picked up the next fish and tried to repeat the movements he had just seen. The first attempt was not very neat. Grandpa Thomas said nothing. He simply adjusted the boy's hand slightly. Slower. Lucas tried again. This time it was better. They worked side by side, almost in silence. From time to time, the wind carried the smell of the river. When all the fish were cleaned, Grandpa Thomas took out a wooden bowl filled with coarse salt. The next step is salt. He grabbed a handful and sprinkled it evenly over the fish. "Salt pulls out the extra moisture," he explained, "and helps preserve the flavor." Lucas repeated the motion. Soon his fingers turned white with salt. The fish lay on the table in neat rows. "Now we wait a little," Grandpa Thomas said. While the fish rested in the salt, they walked to the smokehouse. Grandpa Thomas opened the heavy door. Inside it was dark and smelled of old smoke. Metal hooks hung along the walls. "This is where the fish hangs," the old fisherman said. He brought a small pile of dry wood and a few handfuls of sawdust. "The best smoke comes from fruit wood." he explained. "It's soft and gentle." Lucas watched closely as Grandpa Thomas started the fire. First a small flame, then a little smoke, then more. Soon the smokehouse filled with the rich aroma of warm wood. They returned to the table. The fish had dried slightly. Grandpa Thomas began hanging them on the metal hooks. Careful. Lucas started hanging fish as well. Trout and grayling swayed gently on the hooks. When the last fish was in place, they closed the smokehouse door. A thin ribbon of smoke began drifting slowly from the chimney. Lucas breathed in the smell. It was warm, a little sweet, and very pleasant. "How long will it smoke?" he asked. Grandpa Thomas sat down on a bench near the wall. "A long time." "How long?" "A few hours." Lucas looked surprised. "That long?" The old fisherman nodded. He watched the smoke slowly rising into the sky. "In this craft, you must never rush." Lucas sat beside him. The wind moved quietly through the grass. The river continued its calm journey. Grandpa Thomas looked at the boy and spoke gently. "To make good fish, you must be patient." Lucas breathed in the smell of smoke again, and he understood something new. Fishing is not only about catching fish. Sometimes it is about waiting and doing everything the right way. That evening, the air was calm and warm. The sun had already disappeared behind the forest, but the sky still held a soft, golden glow. Smoke rose slowly from the smokehouse, and the yard was filled with the rich smell of smoked fish. Lucas sat on a wooden bench near the house. From time to time, he looked toward the smokehouse. "Is it ready yet?" he asked. Grandpa Thomas chuckled softly. "No." He added a few small pieces of wood to the fire beneath the smokehouse. "I told you," he said, "to make good fish, you must not rush." Lucas nodded, but every now and then he breathed in the smell of the smoke. It was warm, a little sweet, and very tempting. When the first stars appeared in the sky, Grandpa Thomas finally put out the fire. "Now we let it cool until morning," he said. Lucas was surprised. "Until morning?" "Yes." They closed the smokehouse door and walked back to the house. Night comes quickly in the mountains. The forest around them grew dark. The river sounded louder now than it did during the day. Lucas lay in his bed near the window. He could hear the wind moving softly through the branches. Somewhere far away, an owl called into the night. And outside in the yard, a piece of wood still crackled quietly after the fire. Lucas was almost asleep, and then something crashed. Lucas opened his eyes. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the sound came again, a dull thump, as if something heavy was moving near the shed. Lucas sat up in bed. Then he heard another sound, the creak of wood, as if someone had pushed a door. The boy quietly climbed out of bed and walked to the window. Outside it was dark. Only the pale light of the moon fell across the yard, and in that light something was moving. Lucas could not see it clearly. Another sound followed, a heavy bump, then a rustling noise. "Grandpa," Lucas whispered. From the next room came the calm voice of Grandpa Thomas. "I heard it." Lucas was surprised. "What is it?" For a few seconds, there was silence. Then the old fisherman said calmly, probably a visitor. Lucas did not understand, but Grandpa Thomas said nothing more. "Go to sleep," he said. Slowly, the night became quiet again. Lucas listened for a while longer, but soon sleep finally took him. The next morning, the air was cool. Dew covered the grass. As soon as Lucas stepped outside, he noticed something was wrong. The ground near the smokehouse was torn up, and in the soft dirt there were large tracks, very large. Lucas walked closer. "Grandpa?" Grandpa Thomas was already standing nearby. He looked at the tracks and nodded quietly. "I thought so." Lucas leaned down. "What are they?" "A bear." Lucas's eyes widened. "A bear?" They walked toward the smokehouse. The door was slightly crooked. When Grandpa Thomas opened it, Lucas saw immediately several fish were gone. Empty hooks swayed gently. "He took some of them," the old fisherman said calmly. Lucas walked around the smokehouse. The grass was trampled. A little farther away, a torn fishing net lay on the ground. Lucas picked it up. Oh no! Farther down, near the river, the boat stood by the shore. One side of the wood was scratched. Lucas sighed heavily. "He ruined everything." Grandpa Thomas looked quietly around the yard. Lucas turned toward him. "We lost the fish." The old fisherman nodded. "Yes." "And the nets." "Yes." "And the boat is damaged." Suddenly, Grandpa Thomas chuckled softly. Lucas looked at him in surprise. "Why are you laughing?" The old fisherman looked at the tracks leading towards the forest. Then he looked at the river and calmly said, "The forest also takes its share." Lucas said nothing. He looked again at the large bear tracks, then at the river, and he understood something. Grandpa Thomas was not angry at all, as if this too was simply another part of life by the river. After the bear's visit during the night, the yard looked a little different. The ground near the smokehouse was trampled. Pieces of torn fishing net lay scattered across the grass, and deep scratches from powerful claws marked the smokehouse door. Lucas stood beside the boat and looked at the damaged board. "This is bad," he said quietly. Grandpa Thomas walked closer and ran his hand across the wood. A long scratch ran along the side of the boat. One of the boards had pulled slightly away from the frame. "I've seen worse," the old fisherman said calmly. Lucas looked at him. "You're not angry at all?" Grandpa Thomas shook his head. "Angry at what?" "At the bear." The old man smiled gently. "He was just hungry." Lucas looked at the large tracks that still led toward the forest. "But he ruined our things." Grandpa Thomas nodded. "Yes, that means we have work today." He picked up the torn net from the grass and placed it on the wooden table near the shed. "We start with this." Lucas stepped closer. The net looked worse than it had yesterday. Several threads were broken. Some knots were completely gone. "Can we fix it?" Lucas asked. Grandpa Thomas was already taking out thread in a small wooden netting shuttle. "We can." He sat down on the bench and studied the damage carefully. A fisherman always has something that breaks. Nets, lines, even boats. Lucas sat beside him. "And what do you do then?" The old fisherman looked up. "You repair 'em." He began weaving the threads.
His fingers moved slowly, but with quiet confidence. Knot after knot, the net slowly began to take shape again. Lucas tried to help. At first, the thread kept tangling, but Grandpa Thomas patiently showed him the correct movements. "Don't pull too tight," he said, "otherwise the knot will be stiff." Lucas focused carefully. Time passed slowly. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Warm light filled the yard.
When the net was almost finished, they moved on to the boat. Grandpa Thomas brought tools from the shed. "Hold the board," he said. Lucas pressed the wood firmly, while Grandpa Thomas gently tapped nails with a small hammer. Then they sealed the cracks with thick, dark tar. The smell of tar mixed with the scent of river water and old wood. "This keeps the water out," Grandpa Thomas explained. Lucas ran his hand along the side of the boat. Now the board sat firmly in place. "Almost like new," he said. Grandpa Thomas smiled. "A boat does not need to be new. It needs to be reliable." After that, they cleaned the yard. Lucas coiled ropes, gathered loose threads, and picked up metal hooks that had fallen onto the ground. The work lasted almost the whole day. When the sun began to lean toward the forest, the yard looked peaceful again. The repaired nets hung neatly on the shed wall. The boat stood by the shore, ready for the water. Lucas sat down on the bench and wiped his hands. He felt a pleasant tiredness. "We fixed everything," he said. Grandpa Thomas nodded slowly. He looked toward the river flowing behind the trees. "Remember one thing, Lucas." The boy lifted his head. "What?" The old fisherman looked at him calmly. "In fishing, things do not always go the way you want." Lucas listened quietly. "Sometimes the fish escapes, sometimes the nets tear, and sometimes a bear visits." Lucas smiled softly. Grandpa Thomas placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "But a real fisherman is not the one who always has a good catch." He paused for a moment. "A real fisherman is the one who never gives up after a loss." Lucas looked at the repaired boat, then at the nets, and he understood that today he had learned another important lesson. Sometimes fishing is not about catching fish. Sometimes it is simply about continuing to do your work.
Summer was slowly coming to an end. Lucas noticed it long before Grandpa Thomas said anything. The Mormons had grown colder. When Lucas stepped outside at dawn, the grass beneath his feet was wet with heavy dew, and the air carried that fresh scent that always arrives with autumn. The river had changed, too. The water felt colder, darker. The trout no longer stayed in the shallow water as often as before. Now they had to be found deeper. That morning, Lucas woke up to a familiar sound, the quiet creak of a door. Grandpa Thomas was already preparing the boat. Lucas dressed quickly and stepped outside. The sky was pale gray. A thin mist rested above the river. Lucas breathed in the cold air. "Autumn is close," Grandpa Thomas said. Lucas nodded. He was beginning to understand such things. Together, they pushed the boat into the water. The river was quiet, almost still. Only the gentle current slowly carried the boat forward. Grandpa Thomas rowed slowly.
Today we go a little farther, he said. Lucas looked ahead. They passed familiar rocks. They passed quiet bends of the riverbank where Lucas had already caught fish before. But this time, Grandpa Thomas did not stop. Finally, the boat reached a wider part of the river. Here, the water looked darker. "It's deeper here," Grandpa Thomas explained. "When the water grows colder, the fish move down." Lucas watched the current carefully. He already knew how to read the river. He knew where the water slowed. He knew where the current brought food. Lucas prepared his rod and gently cast the line. The float settled softly on the surface. 1 minute passed, then another. The water moved slowly. Lucas did not rush. He remembered his grandfather's words, patience. And then the float twitched. Lucas froze.
A moment later, the float suddenly disappeared under the water. "I got one!" he shouted. The rod bent sharply. This time, the fish was much stronger. The line tightened as the fish pulled hard to the side. Lucas barely held the rod. "Easy," Grandpa Thomas said calmly. "Don't pull too fast." The fish dove deeper. Water splashed. Lucas felt his arms tighten. "It's big," he said. Grandpa Thomas smiled. "I can see that." The fish made another powerful run. Lucas let out a little line, just as his grandfather had taught him. Then he slowly began to pull it back. The struggle lasted several minutes. The fish did not want to surrender. And then a silver body broke the surface of the water. A trout, and a very large one. "Wow," Lucas whispered. Grandpa Thomas already held the net. "Bring it closer." Lucas carefully guided the fish toward the boat. The trout made one last sudden pull, but this time Grandpa Thomas quickly lowered the net into the water, and the fish was inside. The boat rocked slightly. Lucas breathed heavily. He looked at the trout lying in the net. It was much larger than the first fish he had ever caught. Its silver side shined in the early morning light. Lucas could not stop smiling. "This is the biggest fish I've ever caught." Grandpa Thomas looked carefully at the trout, then at Lucas. His eyes softened a little. "You've learned well," he said. Lucas looked at him. "Because of you." Grandpa Thomas shook his head gently. "No," he nodded toward the river. "Because of her." Lucas placed the trout into the basket. The river flowed quietly around the boat. The sun was beginning to rise above the forest. Grandpa Thomas took the oars. "I think that was a good final catch for this season." Lucas looked at the water, and he felt a strange warmth inside, not only because of the fish, but because he knew his grandfather was proud of him. After the last big fishing trip, the river became quieter. The mornings were colder now. When Lucas stepped outside, his breath turned into a faint white cloud. The leaves on the trees were slowly turning yellow. The wind carried the smell of wet soil and damp forest. Autumn had fully arrived at the river, and with it came different work. They did not fish as often as they did in summer, but when they did, they caught many fish at once. This was the season for preparing food for the long winter. One morning, Lucas woke up to a familiar smell: smoke. He immediately knew what it meant: the smokehouse. He dressed quickly and ran outside. Grandpa Thomas was already working in the yard. On the long wooden table lay rows of cleaned fish, trout, and several large grayling they had caught during the past few days. Smoke slowly rose from the smokehouse and faded into the cold morning air. "You woke up just in time," Grandpa Thomas said. Lucas walked closer. "Are we smoking a lot today?" The old fisherman nodded. "Winter does not like empty shelves." Lucas smiled. He already knew what to do. They worked together, just like before. Lucas cleaned the fish, rinsed them carefully in cold water, and placed them on wooden boards. Grandpa Thomas covered them with salt and checked the hooks inside the smokehouse. The smell of salt, fish, and smoke filled the yard. Slowly, one by one, they hung the fish on metal hooks. The trout swayed gently in the warm smoke rising from the glowing wood below. Lucas breathed in the scent. Now it felt familiar, almost like home. "Do you remember the first time you saw the smokehouse?" Grandpa Thomas asked. Lucas laughed. "I thought everything would be ready in an hour." The old fisherman smiled softly. "Many people think that." They closed the smokehouse door. Smoke drifted slowly from the chimney and spread above the yard. This continued for several days. Morning, fish. Afternoon, the smokehouse. Evening, cool smoke hanging above the yard. Slowly, the house filled with wooden shelves covered with finished smoked fish.
The aroma spread through every room. One day they carried some of the fish to the village again. Lucas already knew the road well. When they appeared on the street with their basket, people began stepping out from their houses. "Thomas," called old Mr. Miller, "you've saved us from another hungry winter." Lucas smiled. Children ran toward the basket. "Is that smoked fish?" a small girl asked. "Yes," Lucas said. "It's very good," said the boy beside her. Grandpa Thomas gave away the fish as calmly as always. Some people paid, some received it for free. "Thank you, Thomas," an elderly woman said from the doorway of her house. Lucas noticed that this time people were looking at him too. "And thank you as well, Lucas," she added. The boy felt a little embarrassed. I'm just helping." Grandpa Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. That's exactly how real work begins. When they returned home, the sun was already sinking behind the forest. A cold wind moved dry leaves along the road. Lucas carried the empty basket. He looked at the river shining between the trees, at the boat waiting quietly by the shore, at the smokehouse where smoke still rose slowly into the evening sky. And suddenly he felt something new, as if all of it, the river, the boat, the nets, the smokehouse, had become part of his life. Lucas smiled quietly. He was no longer just a guest who came for the summer. Now he was part of the work. The first frost arrived quietly. One morning, Lucas woke up and immediately felt that the air had changed. It was colder than any morning before that autumn. When he stepped outside, the grass beneath his feet crunched softly. A thin white frost covered the ground. It lay on the wooden fence and even along the edge of the boat by the shore. Lucas took a deep breath. The air was clean and sharp, like the cold water of the river. The river flowed slowly, dark, calm. There was no mist above the water now, as there had been in summer. Now the river looked deeper, more silent. Grandpa Thomas was already standing beside the boat. He looked at the water as if greeting an old friend before a long farewell. Lucas walked closer. "It's cold today," he said. Grandpa Thomas nodded. "The first frost." Lucas looked at the river. "Are we going fishing today?" Grandpa Thomas slowly shook his head. "No." He rested his hand on the side of the boat. "The season is over." Lucas nodded quietly. He felt a little sad, but he already understood something important. The river has its own rhythm. Sometimes it gives, sometimes it asks you to wait. Together they took hold of the boat. The wood felt cold to the touch. Slowly, step by step, they pulled the boat onto the shore. The sand whispered softly beneath its weight. When the boat stood safely above the waterline, Grandpa Thomas placed old wooden blocks under its frame. "It will rest here until spring," he said. Lucas ran his hand along the side of the boat. The boat had survived many years, and it would survive many more. After that, they walked to the shed. The fishing gear was waiting for its place. The nets were folded carefully and hung on metal hooks. The fishing rods were placed along the wall.
Boxes of hooks and floats returned to the shelves. Lucas worked slowly and carefully. Every object reminded him of summer. The first morning on the boat, the first trout, the day of the big catch. When everything was finally in place, Grandpa Thomas opened an old wooden chest in the corner of the shed. Lucas had never seen him open it before. Inside were a few old belongings, and beside them hung a single fishing rod. It was longer than the rods Lucas had used before. The wood was smooth from many years of use. Grandpa Thomas took it carefully in his hands. Then he turned toward the boy. "Lucas." The boy stepped closer. Grandpa Thomas held out the rod. "This is for you." Lucas looked at it in surprise. "For me?" Grandpa Thomas nodded. "Your first real fishing rod." Lucas took it carefully. The wood still felt warm from his grandfather's hands. He ran his fingers along the smooth surface. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Grandpa Thomas smiled. "It served me well for many years." Lucas looked up. "Are you sure?" The old fisherman placed a hand on his shoulder. "Yes." They walked outside together. The sun was beginning to set above the river. The water turned dark gold. Lucas held the fishing rod and looked at the river. Grandpa Thomas stood beside him. After a moment, he said quietly, "One day, you will teach this to your grandson." Lucas watched the slow current. He imagined returning here again, maybe next summer, maybe many years from now. But he knew one thing for certain. This river would always remain a part of his life. Lucas looked at the quiet, flowing water, and inside his heart, a calm and certain feeling appeared. One day, he would return.